Hey guys, I want to talk to you today about using the Live Paint tool in Illustrator. I think this is really going to help you when you're creating illustrations in the program. One thing about creating illustrations using Illustrator is that sometimes you can't always build something using closed primitive shapes. Okay. And I mean, you can with a lot of things, but sometimes you want to take your own work and you want to bring it in, or you want to be able just to create a drawing in Illustrator just made of paths. You don't have to worry about connecting things. So, for instance, what I've got here on the screen, you can see that if I select, I just have individual paths. Okay. So, that means if I go in and try and color something, I mean, I can, if I go and try and select. See, we discussed open and closed shapes, so these points snap together, creating these weird fill colors because it's an open shape. But what we want to do is we want to take uh, a drawing. We want Illustrator to look at it like it's a coloring page. So where we can select certain areas and just color those without having to worry about connecting everything. Okay, so if I zoom in, you can see that a lot of this isn't even connected. Now, you might want to close things up a little bit and tidy it up, but for the most part, if you didn't want to have to do that, there's an option for you. And a lot of times when I illustrate in Illustrator, I work on paper first, and I scan that in, and I bring it in and make paths using the image trace option. But then I need to make my objects like a coloring page. So first thing we do is we need to look at where this option is. It's called Live Paint. Now in the toolbar, you see that there's under where it says Shape Builder tool, right behind the Width tool there. You can see that there's a Live Paint bucket and Live Paint selection. Now these are the tools you use once you've already created a Live Paint object. We haven't done that yet. So what we need to do is first we need to select the object that we want to convert to this Live Paint group. Now you're going to see that the paintbrush, overall, it appears to be somewhat of a closed shape, but the arm here is wide open, and you'll see the difference in that in the paint group. But anyway, so I'm going to select these objects, and I'm going to go to Object, Live Paint, and there are two options here. You have Make and Gap options. We don't have to worry so much with gap options yet because we need to first make the group. So what we're going to do is Live Paint and Make. And I want you to look at what happens to the selection when I do this. Okay, when I made that Live Paint, your pull bars changed into these star-looking shapes. That's just an identifier to let me know that this is a Live Paint group. It's not a normal thing. Now, it doesn't look like anything happened, but what Illustrator has done it has married all of these paths together. It hasn't connected points or anything like that. Everything else is still pure, the way that you created it. But if I go now to create to my Live Paint bucket, I can use those tools. But I'm going to deselect because I want you to be able to see what's actually going on here. So I come over here and I choose my Live Paint bucket. Select a color. And once I hover over my object, notice that it has broken it into solid pieces. Now, there's some fragments like here, it's not the entire, it just has, those are the gaps we're talking about. And we'll talk about that in a second. But if I click anywhere with a color, it fills that shape. Okay, so say I wanted to paint with blue paint. Over here. And I can make the top a little darker. It's as easy as that. Now, that's a lot easier than creating a closed shape. Now, what you have with the Live Paint group is actually you have two components. You have Live Paint faces and edges. A face is strictly these solid areas that are highlighted when you hover over them. So they're the appearance of closed areas. Edges, if you select your Live Paint selection tool, are all of the pieces. Those are the strokes. But they're not, they are, but they're not. It's kind of a strange thing because we can access them like strokes, but they're not connected like a normal path would be. So if I select one of these edges, I can come over here and change the color of that edge. Grab my live paint bucket and I can color the faces. Okay, so that's kind of a neat thing. I mean, it's a really neat thing, especially if you do a lot of intricate illustrations in Illustrator. You just kind of paint something where we can see what's actually happening. You see the strokes there. So just kind of touch some of this up because I want to be able to release this in a minute. So that was really quick. I've got my paintbrush here that is colored, and I didn't have to worry about connecting things. Now, what's happening with the hand here? Okay, now, because Illustrator looks at your paths and it tries to make these assumptions as to where the closed objects are, the gap here is much too large for Illustrator. Illustrator looks at this as these 2 points here not even being related. So it doesn't make a group for you. So there are some limitations. Now, I can grab my direct selection tool and I can alter this shape just like I would any other pen shape. So if I grab this point, let me say I drag this point even though we know this is not really right. If I grab this point and drag it down, now let's see what Illustrator does. Nope, not, it's too far. And I get it pretty close here. Now, Illustrator looks at that as a closed shape because I've brought these points closer together so it can start to make that assumption. So I can make this arm a different color. Okay, now, what about those gap options? Well, what we just did there is we closed the gap between those 2 points so that Illustrator could read that. And you can go in and change those options. So if I select my object here and go to Object, Live Paint, you see now I have a release, expand, and gap options like we did before. So if I go to gap options, I can tell Illustrator how close points have to be together before it closes the gap. And because I'm in this window, if you look up top on your object, you can see these little red slashes. That is Illustrator's way of showing you where the gaps are. So if I change the color, let's make it bright green, it changes where those gaps are. And so you can see that there are a lot of gaps here. Now, you can select how close these gaps have to be together or how far apart. If you go to Paint Stops at Small Gaps, you can see that it got rid of some of these gaps because they're no longer considered gaps. Or large gaps, you can see now that it changed them again because the gap, you've told the Illustrator that the preferences for the gaps have changed. So you can go in and you can close gaps with paths, which you probably wouldn't want to do here because it would snap lines everywhere. But by default, it's going to be medium gaps. So you can play around with that until you get what you want. Depends on how detailed you were and how close your points were and things like that. So I'm going to click cancel here. I'm not going to save that. And that is using the actual Live Paint tool. Now you have to be careful because if you select a Live Paint group and you come over here to your color options and touch a color, it will treat it like it's one big object. Now the benefit there is you can like initially put in a color and then you can go in and select different colors for the different sections. So I mean if you needed a foundation color, you could do it that way. Same way with stroke. If I go in and select blue, it will treat all those edges like strokes and it will make that all of those strokes blue. Okay, so Last thing, just because you've created an object or live paint object, that doesn't mean you can't still go in and edit the paths. Okay, we did it here, but you could double click any live paint object and it will take you into isolation mode, just like a regular group. And in isolation mode, you can go in and select the different pieces and you can manipulate those, or you can add. Let's say I wanted to add a stroke somewhere in this hand. Well, if I add it while I'm in isolation mode, it becomes part of that live paint object. Now, if I'm not in isolation mode when this happens, it won't actually be added, so it'll just be on top. But because I was in isolation mode, that shape I just created is now part of my live paint group. Okay, so have fun with that. It should change the way you work. Play around with the different options in terms of releasing and expanding. Okay, that's just simply whenever you make a live paint group no longer editable as a live paint group, and so on and so on. So hope it helps. Have fun.